Okay, so let's dive into something I think a lot of our listeners might run into. You built this awesome Reflex app, and you're thinking, okay, now how can I integrate this with Slack? But there's this challenge,
Hmm.
how do you let users securely connect their Slack accounts without, getting access to their passwords or putting anything at risk? And that's where this concept of OAuth comes in, right?
Exactly.
It's kind of like giving your app a special valet key. It can do certain things in the user's Slack workspace, but it never actually sees their login.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And OAuth really lets you have this fine-grained control over what your app can access. It only gets to see what the user explicitly permits.
And in this deep dive, we're going to be focusing on creating what's called an unlisted Slack app. And this is perfect for internal tools, or if you have a limited audience for your app, you don't have to put it out there on the public app directory. So by the end of this, you'll be able to create your own Slack app. You'll be able to set up this whole authorization flow in your Reflex app. You'll know how to handle those all-important access tokens. And finally, you'll be able to actually make API calls to Slack and do something interesting with it. We're going to unpack the whole process, including how users get redirected between your app and Slack during the process. It's like a little digital dance, but we'll make sure you don't step on any toes. So
Okay.
first things first, let's create our unlisted Slack app.
All right, so your starting point is going to be the Slack API website. And you want to head over there and sign in with an account that has admin privileges for your workspace. Ideally, you'd be doing this with like a development workspace. That way you're not accidentally, messing anything up in your live environment.
Okay, so I'm logged into the Slack API website. What do I do next?
So you should see a button that says Create New App, and you want to go ahead and click that and choose from scratch. Now, don't worry, we're not actually building everything from scratch. Slack gives us a nice, solid foundation to work with.
Okay, so I'm giving my app a name. Let's just call it my super cool Reflex app for now.
I like it. Keep in mind that users will actually see this name during the authorization process, so it's good to make it clear and descriptive so they know what they're authorizing. Um, so now you want to go ahead and select your development workspace that you chose earlier and click Create App.
Done and done. What happens now?
All right, so now we're getting into the heart of things. If you go to the basic information section, you're going to find something called app credentials. Think of these as like your app's ID card. You'll definitely need these later on.
Okay, I see my client ID and client secret. Should I be writing these down somewhere?
Absolutely, especially that client secret. Treat this like a precious gem and store it somewhere safe.
Yeah.
You never want to expose this publicly. So environment variables are going to be your best friend here.
Okay, got it. Client secret is locked away in my digital vault. Now, what about these redirect URLs?
Ah, yes, the redirect URLs. So this is the URL where Slack is going to redirect users after they authorize your app or, deny access if they choose to do that. It's basically like sending them back home with a message.
So it needs to be a specific route in my Reflex app, right?
Exactly. It could be something like, https.your-reflex-app.com/Slack callback. One really crucial point here, make sure that this URL is actually accessible from the internet.
Okay, so what if I'm running my app locally, during development?
Yeah, so if you're just using Reflex Run, you might have something like http://localhost.3000 Slack callback. But, adjust the port if needed. And remember, if your Reflex app is using HTTPS in production, that redirect URL also needs to be HTTPS, security first.
Right, makes sense. Okay, so I've added my redirect URLs. Now on to scopes.
Okay, scopes.
I know these are important, but I kind of struggle to understand them clearly.
Yeah, so think of scopes like giving your app a key card to Slack headquarters. Each scope determines which rooms your app is allowed to access. Whether it's just like peeking into the channels room to see a list of channels, or like having full access to send messages in the chat room, you get to choose what level of access your app needs.
Okay, that makes more sense. So if I only wanted my app to read channel history, I wouldn't give it permission to send messages, right?
Exactly. It's all about responsible access and, user privacy. Only request the scopes that your app actually needs. And there's a whole list of scopes available. You can find them in the Slack API documentation, so you can really explore all the options there.
Cool. I think I've got a good handle on scopes now. I've selected the ones my app needs, and I've saved the changes. How do I actually make my app unlisted?
Oh, that's a great question. Since we created the app from scratch, and we're not submitting it to the Slack app directory, it's already unlisted. You can think of it as like an exclusive invite-only app. Users are going to need a direct link to authorize it, which we'll get into a bit later.
Okay, so the app creation part is done. That was pretty straightforward.
Yeah, we've laid the groundwork. And now comes the exciting part. Actually building the OAuth flow directly into your Reflex Python app, that's where we're going to bring everything together.
All right, I'm ready to dive into some code.
Yeah.
But before we do, let's just quickly recap what we've done so far, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So we've created our unlisted Slack app. We've got our secret client ID and our super secret client secret stored safely. We've set up our redirect URL for that little digital dance between our app and Slack. And we've defined those specific permissions or scopes that our app needs.
That's a perfect summary. So now let's move on to the real meat of the process, where we actually build out this OAuth flow in your Reflex app. We'll break down each step and make sure you have a solid understanding of how everything works. So stay tuned.
All right, so we're back. We've got our unlisted Slack app all set up. So now it's time to actually integrate that whole OAuth flow into our Reflex Python app. I'm kind of excited to see how this all comes together in the code.
Yeah, it's like setting up this series of checkpoints between your app and Slack. Just to make sure everything is secure and authorized.
Okay, so I'm picturing like a digital obstacle course now. Where do we even begin with this?
So the first hurdle is generating a special authorization URL in your Reflex app. This is going to be the link that sends users over to Slack to actually grant your app access.
So this URL is kind of like a bridge
Oh, wow.
to that Slack authorization page.
Exactly. Think of it like a secure tunnel. And then once the user actually interacts with Slack, we need to handle their response. And that's where the redirect URL that we talked about earlier comes into play.
Ah, right. Slack sends them back to our app with like a secret code. It's like a secret handshake to prove they're authorized.
That's a great way to put it. So your Reflex app is going to receive that authorization code, which acts like a temporary pass, and we can then exchange this code for the actual access tokens.
And the access tokens is like the golden ticket. That lets our app actually talk to the Slack API.
You got it. And we'll also need to store those tokens securely and even handle refreshing them when they expire. Just like any important pass, it needs to be kept safe and renewed periodically.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. But how do we actually code all of this in Reflex?
So before we dive into the code, let's just take a step back and think about the overall structure. We're going to need to store some configuration values, things like your client ID, your client secret, the redirect URI, the Slack authorization and token endpoints, and of course the scopes that you define for your app.
You mentioned storing the client secret securely. Is that where environment variables come in?
Absolutely. And environment variables are the safest way to handle sensitive information like your client secret. Never hard code it directly into your application code.
Noted. So once we have like our configuration set up, what does the actual OAuth logic look like?
So you'll probably want to create a dedicated Reflex state to manage all things OAuth. You could call it something like SlackAuth state. This is where you're going to centralize all the logic related to your Slack integration.
So this state would store things like the authorization code,
Yeah.
the access tokens, maybe some basic user information. It's like a central hub for everything Slack related.
Precisely. And within this state, you're going to define functions to handle each step of the OAuth process. So the first function is going to be responsible for kicking off the entire flow. Let's call it begin Slack off.
So this begin Slack auth function, that's what constructs that authorization URL and redirects the user to Slack. It's like the function that starts the whole dance.
Right. It takes your app's client ID, the requested scopes,
Yeah.
and your redirect URL, and it carefully encodes all of that into a URL that gets sent to Slack. And then Reflex's rx.redirect function steps in and kind of whisks the user away to Slack's authorization page.
And then assuming the user clicks allow, they get redirected back to our app. And this is where things get interesting on our end.
Yeah, this is where the handle Slack callback function takes center stage. Remember that redirect URL that we set up earlier? It's pointing to a specific route in your Reflex app, and that route is going to trigger this function.
Right? I remember. And that route can then like snatch that authorization code from the URL parameters.
That's exactly how it works. It's like a little treasure hunt within the URL itself. And then comes the critical part, actually exchanging that authorization code for the precious access tokens.
So our handle Slack callback function, it's going to make a POST request to Slack's token endpoint. Using our client ID, our client secret, the authorization code, and the redirect URL, kind of feels like we're piecing together a puzzle with all this information.
That's a perfect analogy. If everything matches up, Slack is going to send back a response. That contains an access token and potentially a refresh token as well. Think of the refresh token like a backup plan. If an access token expires, we can use the refresh token to get a shiny new access token without having to bug the user again.
So it's like having a spare key just in case. But where do we keep these valuable tokens safe? We wouldn't just leave our spare keys lying around.
You're absolutely right. Storing these tokens securely is paramount. A database is typically the best choice for this. It's like having a safe deposit box for your digital keys.
That makes sense. Definitely don't want them floating around in plain sight. Um, what happens if something goes wrong during that token exchange? Do we just like leave the user hanging?
That's a great question, and it's a really common oversight for developers. Robust error handling is absolutely crucial in your handle Slack callback function. If Slack returns an error message, you need to capture that and either display it to the user
Yeah.
or log it for debugging later on. You wouldn't just ignore a problem with your physical keys, right?
Right. Important to know if something isn't working as expected. So we've got our tokens stored securely,
Huh.
and we've taken care of those potential errors. What's the next step in our coding journey?
So now we come to the really fun part, actually using those hard-earned access tokens to communicate with the Slack API. We've set up that secure connection, and now it's time to start talking.
This is where we get to do all the exciting stuff,
Yeah.
like fetching channel data,
Yeah.
sending messages,
Mm.
even automating tasks.
You got it. So you're going to define functions within your Slack auth state to make specific API calls. For example, you might have a function called fetch Slack channels to retrieve a list of channels from the user's workspace.
And each API call needs to include that access token in the request headers for authentication. It's like showing your VIP pass to get backstage access.
Exactly. It's how Slack knows that your app is authorized to access that information.
I'm already picturing all the cool things we can do with these API calls.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get too carried away, let's just quickly recap this part of the process. So we've learned how to generate that authorization URL, handle the user's response, exchange that authorization code for the access tokens, and store those tokens securely.
That's a great summary. We've covered a lot of ground. But there's still more to explore. In the final part, we'll talk about testing your implementation, some essential security considerations, and maybe even get a sneak peek at some real-world examples, so stay tuned.
And we're back for the final part of our OAuth deep dive. It's been quite a journey so far. We created our unlisted Slack app, we integrated the authorization flow into our Reflex Python app, and we even figured out how to make those API calls using our access tokens. But now it's time to make sure it all works seamlessly and securely.
Exactly. Testing and security go hand in hand, especially when you're dealing with sensitive user data. So before we unleash this on the world, let's talk about some really crucial security considerations.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are the most important things to keep in mind?
So first and foremost, never hard code your client secret directly into your code. I know we touched on this before, but it's so important it bears repeating. Always use environment variables or a secure secrets management system to store it. That way it's never exposed in your code base.
Got it. Client secret is locked down tight. What else should we be thinking about?
Always use HTTPS for your Reflex app and your redirect URL, especially in production. This ensures that sensitive data is encrypted during transmission. It's like sending your information through a secure tunnel.
HTTPS check. Anything else?
The way you store those access and refresh tokens is also really critical, so consider using an encrypted database or secure session management within your Reflex app. Remember, these tokens are like keys to a user's Slack account, and we need to handle them with the utmost care.
Yeah, it's like having a high security vault for our digital keys.
Exactly. And always remember the principle of least privilege. Only request the scopes that your Slack app absolutely needs to function. The fewer permissions, the better from a security standpoint. It just minimizes the potential impact if something were to go wrong.
Okay, I've double-checked everything. And it looks like we're ready for launch. Any tips for actually making my app available to other Slack workspaces?
So since we're working with an unlisted app, users won't be able to find it in the Slack app directory, so you'll need to provide them with the direct authorization link that your Reflex app generates. During that initial begin Slack OAuth step.
So it's like a secret handshake.
Yeah.
To gain access to our exclusive app?
Exactly. And before you roll this out to a wider audience, it's always a good idea to test everything thoroughly. In your development workspace, make sure you've ironed out any kinks before going live.
Always a good idea. Don't want any surprises in production.
Okay.
Moment of truth. I'm running my Reflex app. I'm clicking the Authorize Slack app button, and I'm being redirected to the Slack authorization page. Success.
There you go. That's the magic of OAuth in action. So if the user grants your app access, they'll be redirected back to your app with that authorization code, and you can exchange it for the necessary tokens and start using the Slack API.
And from there, the possibilities are endless. I could fetch channel data, send messages, automate tasks, all securely within this framework of OAuth. It's amazing how much power this integration unlocks.
And what's really remarkable is that this whole process isn't limited to just Slack. It works with a wide range of services that support OAuth 2.0. It's really a powerful and versatile tool for connecting your app to the wider world.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We demystified Oath. We built a real-world integration, and we learned some valuable security best practices along the way.
I feel like I have a much deeper understanding now.
Absolutely. You did a great job, and now that you can connect to Slack, just imagine the possibilities. You can build custom notifications, automate workflows, analyze data, and so much more.
It's truly empowering. So to all our listeners out there, if you've ever wanted to integrate your Reflex app with Slack, OAuth is the key. We've provided the blueprint. Now it's time for you to go and build something amazing. And as always, if you have any questions or suggestions for future deep dives, please don't hesitate to reach out. Happy coding.